In my view, motorcycling is becoming more and more of a luxury hobby in the Western world. Think of it like skiing or boating or equestrianism. And in my view, it's really antithetical to the history and culture of motorcycling for it to be this way. So in today's video, we're going to explore if motorcycling currently has a luxury problem. Is the industry's current trajectory posing a daunting threat for enthusiasts who are lower class or middle class even, who just can't see themselves to afford a bike? Or is this all overblown in the face of insanely cool entry-level options that are popping up like weeds nowadays? Let's get into it. So let's take a little history lesson. Fundamentally, motorcycles in the vast majority of the world were seen as a value-driven, practical transportation alternative, particularly after World War II. Let's start with Europe first. After World War II, you had places like Italy, Germany, France, the UK, they were all bombed out and people were broke and poor and they just needed a way to get around, and a simple, lightweight little motorcycle was the perfect way to do it. So European motorcycle culture started from there. Fundamentally, motorcycles just have less components than cars. They have less moving parts, fewer raw materials required, and just way easier to produce. So more people started buying them. Combine that with the fact that the vast majority of cities in Europe are way older and are usually very narrow by their design, it just makes it easier to get around if you have a small two-wheeled vehicle as opposed to a big car. Motorcycling as a sport also developed in Europe because, well, people wanted something fun to do with these machines, and racing them is pretty fun. You had events like the Isle of Man TT. That's one of the most famous two-wheeled racing events in the world, and a very rich history of motorcycle racing took part in Europe. And fundamentally, motorcycling always symbolized youthfulness, rebellion, and adventure. It led to the development of custom bike scenes like scramblers, cafe racers in the UK, and all sorts of really cool things. And hell, do we even need to mention all the amazing manufacturers in Europe? But contrast that with a different country in the 1950s, my home country of Brazil, where motorcycling was introduced a little bit later in the 50s, and it was seen as a luxury item for the elite. They positioned them as something that you could get that was really cool for the ruling class over there. It wasn't until the 1980s, with economic instability, rising inflation, and car prices reaching crazy levels due to protectionist policies that Brazil had implemented there, where you couldn't actually import any four-wheeled vehicles. They had to domestically be produced at the time, that motorcycling became really popular because it was, again, much cheaper and simpler to get. They were more fuel efficient, cheaper to purchase, and cheaper to maintain as well. Brazil also went through an incredible era of urbanization, and some of the largest cities in the world are actually in Brazil. I think São Paulo has something like 25 million people, and owning a two-wheeled vehicle is just easier to get around in places like that. So now those cities depend on couriers and commuters owning two-wheeled vehicles so that everything can work properly. Manufacturers even offered incentives like Honda and Yamaha to actually get more people to be on two wheels. The government even offered incentives and tax breaks to put more people on motorcycles. But today, motorcycling in Brazil still harkens back to its practical, utilitarian nature. Bikes are cheap, reliable, and they offer tremendous advantages over their four-wheeled counterparts, even if you gotta deal with crazy moto boys flying by you while they filter through the corredor. But in the US, motorcycling was always seen as a form of leisure, fun, and a hobby more than anything else. The expansive, wide, and incredible United States highway system is just simply not conducive to owning a small 125cc little motorcycle. Combine that with the fact that in the mid-20th century, Americans had some of the highest purchasing power relative to their GDP that any society has seen ever since, really. Seriously, mid-20th century Americans had no idea how good they had it. American cities were also designed around the highways and sprawl, and so because of the sort of limitless amount of space, small urban areas didn't really develop unless you were looking at the East Coast. And if you live in the suburbs and you're a man in the 1970s, you're a janitor and you can somehow buy a 4-bedroom house and support a wife and 3 children, a motorcycle just isn't going to cut it for a form of transport. You really need a car to move your family around 4 lanes of traffic when you get off to the main road. But you may have had a Harley Davidson in your garage because guess what? You had ample money to buy a toy. Returning soldiers in World War II sparked an incredible interest in motorcycling, and they really started off the whole thing. This led to the popularity of motorcycle clubs, events, biker cultures, outlaws, gangs, hell, even the Easy Rider movement, choppers. All of that was wrapped up in the American identity. But all the while, all of these motorcycles remained accessible to people. You didn't need to be some doctor or lawyer or a chartered accountant to be able to afford a Harley Davidson. You didn't need to make an incredible amount of money to buy something like a motorcycle on the side. I mean, can we just pause and take a moment? Imagine if an outlaw biker from the 1950s came to 2024 and saw the current motorcycling landscape. It'd be like when you give a sour candy to a Victorian child and just watch their head explode. I think it's a pretty fair generalization to say that the kind of free-spirited motorcycling thing that was happening in the 50s, 60s, and even into the 70s is just not really attainable by people nowadays in America. When Honda took over the US market in the 70s, they were trying to find literally as many people as possible to get on motorcycles. They did not care if they were older, younger, men, women. They just wanted anybody and everybody to get a bike. Motorcycles weren't positioned as luxury or niche goods. They just wanted more people to own them because that was mass market capitalism in the mid-20th century. Now, let's talk about the modern day because unfortunately, that is no longer the case. Motorcycling, while being super popular and accessible in developing markets such as Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even India, has become a bit bifurcated. On the one end, manufacturers produce incredible amounts of volume for these markets. Think of the sub 300cc categories. There are some bikes you may not have even heard of that sell tens of millions of units every single year. But now, even in North America and parts of Europe, with people's wallets being stretched to the absolute maximum, affordable entry-level bikes are making a bit of a comeback. I mean, Triumph's 400s is an incredible case study, and one that I think we'll look back on several years from now as a motorcycle that really started to tip the scales, because it works well in America as an entry-level, fun, cheap, affordable bike, but it positions really well in the developing world as a premium motorcycle, working really well as a global release. And in general, entry-level bikes are the best they've ever been in terms of performance, value, and just sort of what you get for the money. And then on the other end, we have insanely super premium flagship motorcycles that could not have ever even been conceived of back in the day. These big, powerful flagship motorcycles see all of the tech and innovations that the industry has to offer, and the higher prices that go along with it. And it seems like every year they get more and more and more expensive. Not even relatively speaking, just absolutely speaking too. There's of course your Harley Davidsons, Ducatis, BMWs, MV Agustas, but even some of the big four have started playing around in this kind of past $20,000 mark for a motorcycle thing. There are brands like Harley and Ducati that have just simply solidified themselves as luxury brands. They're no longer interested in trying to appeal to a mass majority of people, which Harley Davidson is a whole other video because they somehow played the trick of being blue collar and yet they sell a $50,000 CVO. Their entry-level bike is $12,000. What are we talking about? There's nothing blue collar about that. And Ducati does the same thing. They can charge damn near $50,000 for a special edition Pecco Bagnaia V4S. The sweepstakes for the Ninja 500 is almost over. At the end of November, your chances to win this bike will be gone. Head over to the website, become a member on yammynoob.co to get your best chances to win this Ninja 500. I've given away over 54 motorcycles on my time here on YouTube, so I think I know what I'm doing. Head to the website, don't miss your chance to win. This one is gonna be gone before you know it. But it seems like the tides may be changing because these companies can't just charge whatever they want anymore for these bikes. Harley Davidson recently posted a 40% decrease in sales. Ouch. For Q3, Harley Davidson reported 40% fewer bikes sold than last year the same time. That's pretty brutal. It's almost as if their strategy of shifting away from more roads to Harley Davidson and just focusing on selling $50,000 CVOs wasn't really all that intelligent. A lot of brands are trying to do this. They're trying to eke out incredible margins and incredible price points from an incredibly small customer base. Now, this works for some brands, but I think with motorcycling, it doesn't really add up. Because the issue is, people expect these bikes to be incredibly high performing, and very, very few people can even access the performance these bikes offer, let alone afford them. And as a buyer, you start to see rapidly diminishing returns when you look at the top end of a motorcycle manufacturer's lineup. I mean, why spend upwards of $20,000 on a motorcycle when you can realistically only use about 20% of its performance any given time on the street? Do manufacturers really think that there's just a queue of people lining up to buy $25,000 liter bikes just to brag to their buddies? And truthfully, the status symbol angle doesn't really work with bikes. I mean, if you buy a McLaren or a Ferrari or a Lamborghini, you drive it around because you want people to view you as a high status individual. Bikes just don't really have that same cachet. As mentioned, they're following generations of being accessible, blue collar, practical, utilitarian. So even if you're rolling around on some fancy Ducati, it's never going to have the same appeal as if you pull up in a Ferrari. So paying a gigantic premium for a motorcycle that's not going to have any clout to normal people, except maybe even to motorcyclists, doesn't really make sense, and I think people are catching on. Top of the line bikes get a ton of investment. The low end of the market is getting a ton of investments, with trickle down happening here in the United States with global bikes making their debut. And the middle of the market is really getting hollowed out. Kind of sounds like the global economy, if you ask me. Now, it might be easy to place the blame on Harley-Davidson, MV Agusta, or Ducati for causing this problem. For them, for helping to push motorcycling into a luxurious arena that most people did not want it to go to, but that actually might not be the case. When you compare original MSRP for top-of-the-line bikes back in the 70s to today, you start to see a very different picture. When the Honda CB750 was released in 1969, its MSRP was $1,500. By most metrics, this was the most well-equipped, best-performing motorcycle you could buy back in the day. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $13,000 today. When the GPZ 900 was introduced by Kawasaki back in 1984, it set a whole new standard for superbikes. It had an original MSRP of $4,500, which is about $14,000 today. Comparatively, when Ducati released the 916, it cost $14,500, which is about $31,000 today. So twice the price of a Japanese bike and half as reliable. So whether you're talking about a Japanese bike or Ducati, truthfully, the prices have stayed pretty much on track, even adjusted for inflation. Ducatis have always been expensive, but the quality's gotten better, and honestly, everything's improved just about tenfold. You can't even compare an 80s bike to a 2024 motorcycle. You have way more highly engineered engines, liquid cooling, variable valve timing, fuel injection, way more reliable, way more power, way more sophisticated frames, better geometry. I mean, there is no comparison. And yet, adjusted for inflation, it's the same price. So the problem lies in the fact that motorcycling has stayed on track, but like everything else, wages have not. From about 1970 until 2020, productivity increased 60%, but wages have only gone up 17% after adjusting for inflation over 50 years. Look, I harp on this graph all the time, but if you look at productivity versus wages over the last 50 years, it tells you the story of pretty much everything that's going on in the world right now. And a lot of those increases are being seen to the top end of earners, especially here in America. Middle and lower class people have seen even smaller increase. I mean, hell, some states still have a federal minimum wage of like $7 an hour. What are you going to do with $7 in 2024? Buy one Big Mac? You can't even eat out for what are you going to do with $7? So if you think about it that way, it makes sense that the motorcycle market is trying to find customers that are actually making more money and appeasing themselves to those people. If you have a group of people that are earning 5, 10, 20 times as much as they used to back in the day, maybe you can sell them a couple $100,000 motorcycles, and that margin is maybe enough of the same of if you sold 50 small displacement motorcycles. That's the strategy. But for middle class people and lower class people, this really doesn't add up. So in the United States, the average cost of a new motorcycle is $12,000. That's just including all the bikes for sale today, right? So the average person is probably going to spend pretty close to $15,000 out the door to get this machine. Not many people that are in that category have that kind of money lying around, certainly not to spend on a motorcycle. A couple of years ago, I remember, I think it said 40% of Americans can't even cover a $500 expense without going into debt. So where do you think they're going to get $12,000 to go and plunk down on some ridiculous bike? So they have to go take out a loan for it, and interest rates are really high right now, so they're probably going to be slapped with a 12, 15, maybe 18% loan on a $15,000 bike, paying it off for, what, 7 years? It's just terrible financial math. And I know what you're gonna say, that's why I always buy my bikes used. But folks, if everybody buys a used motorcycle, you no longer have a motorcycle market. You literally need people to buy new bikes so that you can then go buy used bikes if you wanna be a cheap bastard, which I'm all for. I'm a cheap bastard myself. One of the most uncomfortable truths that we don't like talking about in motorcycle media is that motorcycling has never rebounded back to its pre-2008 levels. If there's anything else, I talked about the wages versus productivity graphs, but really the 2008-2009 financial recession was really another kind of turning point for everything that is happening in the world right now. Some people even have the theory that we never really recovered from 2008, 2009. That was like the moment that like all culture ceased to exist. And that's when algorithmic things started happening with our social media feeds and the world economy became this weird zombie economy. There's a lot to say about that, but I think motorcycling is starting to reflect that too. But Honda's new Hornet 1000 is a really interesting development in this segment. And we actually made a whole video about it last week. Go and check that out because it might be the canary in the coal mine for what's actually going to happen in motorcycling. Because as much as we hope and wish that wages are going to magically increase 30, 40, 50% year over year, it's just simply not going to happen because that would be immediately inflationary to the entire economy. Wages are surprisingly sticky. They don't tend to go up very much. As horrible as it is to say, most people's wages tend to just creep up year over year, even if inflation runs amok or the prices of everything goes up like crazy. So maybe we'll see manufacturers come in at below market prices and offering motorcycles that have real value built in. So it's kind of crazy that motorcycling started off as this, recreational, fun, youthful thing that anybody could get into and has now been relegated to either being like total broke boy activities or crazy, luxurious track day dad or BMW dad activities. It kind of is antithetical to the whole spirit of motorcycling. It's incredibly ironic given that most people my age, kind of 30 plus, grew up looking at motorcycles as being rebellious and youthful and adventurous, only to realize by the time they grew up, they couldn't even afford one to be adventure or rebellious if they wanted to. I kind of hope that companies like KTM and Harley Davidson specifically, with their tactic of trying to squeeze as much money as possible out of people, continue to do poorly. I don't want to reward companies for trying to find ways to shirk people out of more money when they don't need to. Think of all the needless tech packages or the ridiculous paint schemes that Harley Davidson sells. I really hope that consumers vote with their wallets and reject ridiculous, luxurious money grabs that motorcycle manufacturers are trying to make. And I bet you we'll see a huge reckoning. And we already have with CF Moto coming in with incredibly value-driven products, which is a little, tenuous because the Chinese government basically props them up, but that's a whole other video as well. The recent attention to beginner models is excellent, and that's going to get a lot of people into the pipeline. But if you don't fix the middle end of the market, something's going to have to give. Not everyone's going to ride a 400 forever, and there's only so many used SV650s to go around. All right, guys, what do you think? Is motorcycling suffering a luxury problem? What do you think about the topics in today's video? I hope you enjoyed today's deep dive on motorcycling having some issues from an economic perspective. Thanks so much for checking out today's video. I appreciate it. We'll catch you in the next one. See you later. If only there was a way for you to stop being a bikeless bro. I'm so tired of hearing you guys talk about you don't have a motorcycle when I'm giving this one away for free. I've given away 54 motorcycles on this channel. Go to yamanube.co while you're waiting for this next video to queue up and become a member and sign up to win this thing. You're not going to regret it. I guarantee it.